In a world where royal protocols dictate every movement and security details choreograph each public appearance, one moment of genuine spontaneity can spark global headlines. When Princess Catherine slipped behind the wheel of her own car that crisp autumn morning, she had no idea that this simple act of independence would become one of the most talked-about royal moments of the year. The image that emerged from Windsor Castle that day wasn't of a princess being chauffeured in a state vehicle or escorted by a convoy of security cars. Instead, it captured something far more extraordinary. A future queen driving herself to an important reception, her hands confidently gripping the steering wheel, her expression one of quiet determination and unmistakable joy. This wasn't just another royal engagement. This was a statement that would resonate across social media platforms, inspire countless discussions about modern royalty, and remind the world that beneath the tiara and formal titles lives a woman who values her independence and isn't afraid to show it. What started as a practical decision to drive herself to Windsor Castle became a powerful symbol of how the monarchy continues to evolve in the 21st century. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Photos of Catherine at the wheel spread like wildfire across news outlets and social media platforms. Royal watchers who had grown accustomed to seeing members of the royal family arrive at events in official vehicles were struck by the refreshing normalcy of the scene. Here was a senior royal doing something millions of people do every day, driving her own car, yet it felt revolutionary in its simplicity. But this story goes deeper than just a drive to a castle. It's about a woman who has spent over a decade learning to balance her role as a future queen with her desire to remain authentic and relatable. It's about the careful dance between royal protocol and personal choice. And it's about how one spontaneous decision can capture the imagination of people around the world who are hungry for genuine moments in an increasingly artificial age. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Adelaide Cottage as Princess Catherine stood at her bedroom window, watching the early mist rise from the gardens. It was Tuesday, October 15th, and her calendar showed a busy day ahead, culminating in an important reception at Windsor Castle that evening. The event, organised to honour outstanding community volunteers from across Berkshire, was close to her heart. These were the unsung heroes who had quietly transformed their communities, and Catherine felt a deep responsibility to acknowledge their work properly. As she reviewed her schedule over breakfast with Prince William, who was preparing for his own engagements that day, the conversation turned to logistics. The Royal Protection Team had already briefed them on the security arrangements for the evening. A convoy would collect Catherine at 5:30, allowing plenty of time for the short journey to Windsor Castle and the necessary security protocols upon arrival. But as Catherine sipped her morning tea, something felt different about this day. Perhaps it was the crisp autumn air that seemed to promise adventure. Or maybe it was the realization that the drive to Windsor Castle from their Windsor home would take less than 15 minutes on familiar roads. She had driven these routes countless times before becoming a senior working royal, back when such independence was taken for granted. The idea formed gradually the way most spontaneous decisions do. What if she drove herself? The notion seemed almost radical given the layers of protocol that surrounded every royal movement. Yet it wasn't unprecedented. She had driven to various engagements before, particularly during her earlier years as a royal. But this felt different somehow, more significant. Catherine shared her thoughts with William over breakfast, watching his expression carefully. His initial concern was evident, the protective instincts of both a husband and a future king coming to the surface. They discussed the practical implications, the security considerations, and the potential media attention. But as they talked, William began to understand what this meant to his wife. It wasn't just about driving herself to an event. It was about maintaining a connection to the woman she had been before royal life consumed her daily existence. The conversation continued as they walked through their home, past family photos that captured ordinary moments in their extraordinary lives. Catherine spoke about feeling the weight of constant protection, the way even simple activities required advanced planning and security sweeps. She missed the spontaneity of jumping in a car and driving wherever she wanted to go. This reception, honoring people who had maintained their authentic selves while serving others, seemed like the perfect occasion to reclaim a small piece of her independence. By mid-morning, the decision was made, though not without considerable discussion with their protection team. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews, who had been part of Catherine's security detail for several years, initially expressed concerns about the change in protocol. The route would need to be assessed, backup plans established, and contingency measures put in place. But as they worked through the details, it became clear that the journey was manageable with appropriate precautions. The security team agreed to a modified arrangement. Catherine would drive her own vehicle, a dark green Range Rover that she particularly loved, with a discreet security car following at a distance. The route would be the most direct path to Windsor Castle, avoiding areas known for heavy media presence. Communication systems would ensure constant contact, and the arrival protocol at the castle would remain unchanged. Catherine spent the afternoon attending to her usual royal duties, but there was an undeniable energy about her that her staff noticed. Lady-in-waiting Rebecca Morrison later recalled that the princess seemed more animated than usual, as if she were looking forward to something special. During their final preparation meeting for the evening's reception, Catherine reviewed the guest list with particular attention, wanting to ensure she could speak knowledgeably with each honoree about their specific contributions to their communities. The guests being honoured that evening represented a remarkable cross-section of British society. There was Margaret Thompson, an 82-year-old retired teacher who had spent the past decade organising literacy programs for immigrant families. James Parker, a former soldier who had established a network of support groups for veterans struggling with mental health issues. Sarah Chen, a young entrepreneur who had created an app connecting elderly residents with volunteers for grocery shopping and companionship during the pandemic. Each story represented the kind of grassroots heroism that Catherine had come to deeply admire. As late afternoon approached, Catherine felt a familiar mixture of excitement and nervousness that she hadn't experienced in years. It reminded her of the feeling she used to get before driving to important job interviews or meeting William's friends for the first time. There was something liberating about the prospect of being in control of her own journey, even if it was just for a 20-minute drive. The wardrobe selection for the evening had been carefully considered. Catherine chose a deep navy dress by one of her favourite British designers, paired with jewellery that had belonged to Prince Philip's mother, Princess Alice. The choice was deliberate, honouring both tradition and her commitment to supporting British fashion. But as she prepared for the evening, she found herself thinking less about how she would look and more about how she would feel sitting behind the wheel of her own car. At exactly 5:15, 15 minutes before the originally scheduled departure time, Catherine made her way to the garage where her Range Rover waited. The PAA had been thoroughly inspected by security, and the route programmed into the navigation system despite her familiarity with the roads. Detective Inspector Matthews did a final check of the communication equipment and reviewed the emergency procedures one last time. As Catherine settled into the driver's seat and adjusted her mirrors, she caught sight of herself in the rearview mirror and smiled. It had been months since she had been alone in a car responsible for her own transportation. The feeling was both nostalgic and empowering. She thought about all the times she had driven this route before her marriage, when she was simply Catherine Middleton, and how natural it had felt then. The engine started with a quiet purr, and Catherine took a deep breath before putting the car in gear. Through the windshield, she could see the security car positioned discreetly nearby, ready to follow. But for the first time in a long while, she would be leading the way rather than being transported as a passenger. It was a small act of independence that felt monumentally significant. As she pulled out of the driveway, Catherine couldn't have known that this simple decision would capture the attention of royal watchers around the world. She was simply a woman looking forward to honoring some remarkable people while enjoying a few precious minutes of independence on familiar roads. The autumn afternoon stretched ahead, full of possibility and the promise of an evening celebrating the very best of human nature. The journey to Windsor Castle would take her through some of the most beautiful countryside in England, past fields where horses grazed peacefully, and through villages where ordinary people were living extraordinary lives of service and dedication. It seemed fitting that she would drive herself to an event honouring such people, taking control of her own journey just as they had taken control of their community's needs. As the gates of her home disappeared in her rearview mirror, Catherine felt a sense of freedom that had become increasingly rare in her royal life. The road ahead was familiar, yet felt new with possibility. She had no idea that photographers would capture her arrival, or that the image of her confident grip on the steering wheel would become one of the most widely shared royal photos of the year. She was simply enjoying the drive and looking forward to an evening of meaningful conversations with people who had dedicated their lives to helping others. The countryside unfolded before Catherine, like a familiar painting come to life as she guided her Range Rover along the winding roads toward Windsor Castle. The late afternoon light filtered through the autumn leaves, creating a golden canopy overhead that seemed to celebrate her decision to take this journey into her own hands. For the first time in months, she was experiencing the simple pleasure of being alone with her thoughts while navigating roads she knew by heart. As she drove, Catherine found her mind wandering to the early days of her relationship with William, when drives like this were commonplace. She remembered weekend trips to visit friends, spontaneous decisions to explore new villages, and the freedom of being able to change direction on a whim. Those memories felt like glimpses of another life, one where her movements weren't choreographed and her schedule wasn't managed down to the minute. The radio played softly in the background, a local station featuring a mix of current hits and classic songs that seemed perfectly suited to the golden hour lighting. When a Beatles song came on, Catherine found herself humming along, something she rarely did in the presence of others. There was something wonderfully ordinary about singing along to the radio while driving, a reminder of the person she had been before royal duties shaped her daily existence. Her phone, connected to the car's hands-free system, remained blissfully quiet. Her private secretary had cleared the next hour of any calls or urgent matters, understanding that this journey represented something important to the princess. The silence was golden, broken only by the gentle hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves as a breeze swept across the road. Catherine passed through the village of Ascot, where people were going about their evening routines, unaware that royalty was driving through their community. She saw a mother pushing a stroller while walking a dog, an elderly man tending to his garden, and teenagers gathered outside the local cafe, probably discussing weekend plans. These glimpses of ordinary life reminded her of why the evening's reception was so important to her. These were the communities where real heroes lived and worked, often without recognition or fanfare. The security car following at a discreet distance was so unobtrusive that Catherine sometimes forgot it was there. Detective Inspector Matthews had positioned her team perfectly, maintaining the necessary protection while allowing Catherine to feel genuinely independent. It was a delicate balance that required considerable skill and planning, and Catherine felt grateful for their professionalism. As she approached a familiar intersection, Catherine made a spontaneous decision that surprised even herself. Instead of taking the most direct route to Windsor Castle, she turned onto a smaller road that would take her through Windsor Great Park. It would add perhaps 10 minutes to her journey, but the scenic route through the ancient parkland felt appropriate for this special evening. She used the car's communication system to inform her security detail of the route change, receiving an immediate acknowledgement that they would adjust accordingly. The drive through Windsor Great Park was breathtaking in the autumn afternoon light. Ancient oak trees, some of which had been standing for centuries, created a natural cathedral along the roadside. Catherine slowed down to appreciate the view, something she could never have done in an official convoy with a rigid schedule. The freedom to adjust her pace and enjoy the scenery felt almost revolutionary after years of tightly controlled transportation. She passed the statue of the Copper Horse, the iconic monument to King George III that dominated the park's landscape. The sight always moved her, representing centuries of royal history and the continuity of the monarchy through changing times. Today, it felt particularly symbolic as she drove herself toward her own place in that history, choosing to honor both tradition and personal authenticity. A group of deer grazed peacefully in a clearing visible from the road, their presence a reminder of the wild beauty that had been preserved within these royal grounds for generations. Catherine pulled over briefly in a designated area, something she couldn't have done in an official motorcade, and watched the deer for a few moments. The sight filled her with a sense of peace and connection to the natural world that often felt absent from her heavily scheduled royal life. Her mind turned to the evening ahead and the remarkable people she would meet. Catherine had spent considerable time studying their stories, wanting to understand not just what they had accomplished, but why they had chosen to dedicate themselves to serving others. Margaret Thompson's literacy programs had helped over 300 immigrant families improve their English skills, opening doors to better employment and deeper community integration. The impact was measurable, but Catherine was more interested in the motivation behind such sustained dedication. James Parker's work with veteran mental health support had grown from his own struggles after returning from Afghanistan. His vulnerability in sharing his story had created safe spaces for other veterans to seek help, ultimately saving lives that might otherwise have been lost to suicide or despair. Catherine had read testimonials from veterans whose lives had been transformed by the programs James had created, and she felt honored to recognize his courage in turning personal pain into community healing. Sarah Chen's innovation during the pandemic had connected over 5,000 elderly residents with volunteers, but the real story was how the app had created lasting friendships that continued long after lockdown restrictions ended. Catherine had spoken with some of the participants by phone in preparation for the evening, learning how technology had facilitated genuine human connections during a time of enforced isolation. As she continued through the park, Catherine reflected on how these individuals had chosen to drive their own journeys of service, taking control of their community's needs just as she was taking control of her transportation this evening. There was something poetic about the parallel that made her smile as she navigated the gentle curves of the Parkland Road. The sun was beginning to set, casting longer shadows across the landscape and painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Catherine realized that this was the first sunset she had watched while driving in over a year. The beauty of the natural world, experienced from behind the wheel of her own car, felt like a gift she had given herself. The decision to drive to the reception was proving to be about more than just transportation. It was about reconnecting with simple pleasures that had been lost in the complexity of royal life. As she approached the final stretch of road leading to Windsor Castle, Catherine could see the ancient towers rising majestically against the evening sky. The sight never failed to impress her, but tonight it felt different. She wasn't being delivered to the castle as a passenger. She was arriving under her own power, having chosen her route and controlled her timing. The symbolism wasn't lost on her, as she prepared to honor individuals who had similarly taken control of their circumstances to help others. The castle grounds came into view, with their perfectly maintained gardens and historic architecture creating a scene of timeless grandeur. Catherine knew that within those walls, staff members were making final preparations for the reception, arranging flowers, checking sound systems, and ensuring that every detail would be perfect for the evening's honored guests. The contrast between the formal preparation awaiting her and the informal journey she had just completed seemed to capture the duality of her royal existence. As she neared the castle's entrance, Catherine felt a mixture of satisfaction and slight regret that the drive was coming to an end. The 25 minutes of independence had been more refreshing than she had anticipated, providing not just transportation, but a valuable opportunity for reflection and connection with the world beyond royal protocols. She made a mental note to discuss with her team how such opportunities might be incorporated more regularly into her schedule when appropriate. The gates of Windsor Castle appeared ahead, staffed by guards who would recognize her vehicle and facilitate her entry into the secure compound. Catherine straightened in her seat and prepared to transition from independent driver back to her role as the Princess of Wales, ready to honor the remarkable individuals who had transformed their communities through dedication and service. The journey had prepared her perfectly for the evening ahead, grounding her in the authentic values that connected her to the people she served. As Catherine approached the main entrance to Windsor Castle, she noticed something unusual. A small group of royal photographers, who typically positioned themselves to capture arriving dignitaries, seemed more animated than usual. Their cameras were already trained on her vehicle, and she could see the rapid-fire flashes even before she reached the designated parking area. It dawned on her that news of her decision to drive herself had somehow preceded her arrival, creating an unexpected media moment. The security guards at the castle entrance maintained their professional composure, but Catherine could detect subtle smiles as they recognized her behind the wheel. These men and women, who saw countless official arrivals every week, clearly found something refreshing about the princess driving herself to a royal engagement. Their reaction confirmed what Catherine had felt during the journey. There was something special about this simple act of independence. As she pulled into the designated area within the castle walls, Catherine could see members of her advance team waiting nearby. Private Secretary Amanda Hughes approached the vehicle with a bemused expression that suggested she too was surprised by the media attention the arrival was generating. Through the car window, Amanda briefed Catherine on the photographer's presence and confirmed that the evening's schedule remained on track despite the unconventional arrival. Catherine took a moment to gather her thoughts before stepping out of the vehicle. The transition from private driver to public royal required a mental shift that she had perfected over years of public service, but tonight it felt different. The drive had energized her in a way that being transported as a passenger never did, and she felt more connected to her authentic self as she prepared to meet the evening's guests. Detective Inspector Matthews appeared at her door, having arrived in the security vehicle just moments after Catherine. Her expression was professional, but Catherine could detect a hint of pride in her protection officer's demeanor. Matthews had been instrumental in making the evening's unconventional transportation possible, and the successful arrival validated her team's careful planning and risk assessment. Stepping out of the Range Rover, Catherine immediately felt the cool evening air and heard the distant sounds of Windsor's evening activities. Church bells chiming the hour, traffic on nearby roads, and the general hum of a community settling into evening routines. These ordinary sounds, which she rarely noticed when arriving in official convoys, felt grounding and authentic after her solitary drive through the countryside. The castle staff who greeted her arrival seemed genuinely delighted by her unconventional entrance. Lord Chamberlain Sir Marcus Thompson, who had overseen countless royal arrivals in his distinguished career, approached with what could only be described as a broad grin. His comment that it was refreshing to see a royal take the wheel again spoke to something deeper than mere novelty. It represented a connection to more accessible traditions of royal behavior. As they walked toward the castle's main entrance, Catherine learned that word of her independent drive had already reached some of the evening's guests. Several of the community volunteers being honored had expressed particular pleasure at learning that the princess had driven herself to meet them. For people who spent their lives taking initiative and controlling their own destinies while serving others, Catherine's decision to drive herself resonated as a meaningful gesture of respect and solidarity. Inside the castle, final preparations for the reception were underway. The state dining room had been transformed for the evening, with elegant floral arrangements featuring autumn blooms from the castle's own gardens. The setting was formal enough to honor the significance of the guests' contributions while maintaining an atmosphere of warmth and accessibility that would encourage genuine conversation. Catherine used the few minutes before guests arrived to review her notes one final time. Each honoree had been carefully selected not just for their achievements but for their embodiment of the values that the royal family sought to promote: service, dedication, and authentic commitment to improving their communities. The evening would provide opportunities for meaningful conversations that went far beyond formal recognition ceremonies. Margaret Thompson was the first guest to arrive, and her reaction upon learning that Catherine had driven herself to the reception was immediate and delighted. The elderly literacy advocate explained that she had been driving herself to community programs for over 60 years, believing that personal independence was essential to effective service. The shared experience of controlling their own transportation became an immediate connection point between the princess and the volunteer. James Parker arrived with his wife Sarah, both of them still somewhat overwhelmed by the invitation to Windsor Castle. When Catherine mentioned her drive to the reception, James immediately understood the significance. As a former soldier who had learned to value self-reliance, he appreciated the princess's decision to take responsibility for her own arrival. Their conversation quickly moved beyond pleasantries to discuss the deeper meanings of independence and service. Young entrepreneur Sarah Chen was perhaps the most excited of all the guests to learn about Catherine's unconventional arrival. As someone who had built her business around empowering others to take control of their circumstances, she saw the princess's drive as embodying the same spirit of self-determination that had motivated her own community work. Their discussion about the importance of personal agency and creating positive change was one of the most engaging conversations Catherine had had in months. Throughout the early stages of the reception, Catherine found that her drive to the castle had become an unexpected conversation starter. Guests seemed more relaxed and willing to share their own stories when they learned that the princess had chosen such a normal, relatable approach to attending the event. The shared experience of driving oneself to important occasions created common ground that formal protocols often prevented. The photographers outside had captured not just Catherine's arrival, but also her obvious satisfaction as she stepped out of the vehicle. The images would later show a confident, relaxed princess who appeared genuinely happy to be taking control of her own transportation. The contrast with typical arrival photos, which often showed royals emerging from official vehicles with more formal expressions, was striking and immediate. Castle staff members, from senior officials to housekeeping personnel, commented throughout the evening on the positive energy that seemed to surround the princess. Many attributed it to her unconventional arrival, suggesting that the simple act of driving herself had somehow recharged her enthusiasm for the royal duties ahead. The observation was perceptive. Catherine felt more engaged and authentic after controlling her own journey to the event. As the reception moved into its formal phase, with speeches recognizing each volunteer's contributions, Catherine reflected on how her decision to drive had enhanced her preparation for these important conversations. The quiet time during the journey had allowed her to center herself and remember why these recognitions mattered, both to the recipients and to the broader community they represented. The media attention generated by her arrival was already spreading beyond the traditional royal photography corps. Social media posts from castle visitors and local residents who had spotted the princess driving herself were beginning to circulate, creating a buzz that extended far beyond the planned coverage of the reception itself. The spontaneous public reaction suggested that people were hungry for authentic moments from their royal family. Lord Chamberlain Thompson later reflected that in his decades of service, he had rarely seen such immediate and positive public reaction to a royal arrival. The combination of Catherine's obvious contentment and the public's appreciation for her independence created a moment that resonated far beyond its apparent simplicity. It reminded him of earlier generations of royals who had maintained closer connections to ordinary experiences while fulfilling their ceremonial duties. As the evening progressed, Catherine realized that her decision to drive herself had accomplished something she hadn't fully anticipated. It had not only recharged her own sense of autonomy, but it also created a more authentic atmosphere for honoring people who had dedicated their lives to taking initiative in their communities. The parallel between her independent arrival and their independent service created a thematic coherence that elevated the entire event. The success of the unconventional arrival was already being discussed by royal household staff as a model for future engagements when appropriate. The positive reaction from both guests and the public suggested that carefully planned moments of royal independence could enhance rather than diminish the impact of official events. Catherine's drive to Windsor Castle was becoming more than just transportation. It was evolving into a symbol of how modern royalty could maintain authenticity while fulfilling traditional responsibilities. The formal reception began as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the ancient windows of Windsor Castle's state dining room. Catherine, still energized from her independent drive, moved through the gathering with a natural ease that seemed to put every guest immediately at comfort. The intimate setting, designed for meaningful conversation rather than grand ceremony, perfectly complemented the authentic atmosphere that her unconventional arrival had already established. Margaret Thompson, the retired teacher whose literacy programs had transformed hundreds of lives, found herself seated next to Catherine during the dinner portion of the evening. Their conversation began with Margaret's surprise and delight at learning about the princess's decision to drive herself, but quickly evolved into a deeper discussion about the importance of maintaining personal independence while serving others. Margaret shared stories of elderly immigrants who had overcome decades of language barriers through her programs, their determination reminding Catherine of her own commitment to controlling her journey through royal life. The elderly volunteer's eyes sparkled as she described Ahmed, a Syrian refugee who had arrived in Britain speaking no English and was now working as a teaching assistant in the same school where he had first learned to read English words. Margaret explained how Ahmed's transformation had required not just language skills, but also the confidence to believe in his own capability. Catherine found parallels in her own journey, understanding how taking control of seemingly small decisions could build the confidence needed for larger challenges. James Parker, the veteran who had transformed his own struggle with post-traumatic stress into a network of support programs, engaged Catherine in a conversation about resilience and the courage required to seek help. When Catherine mentioned how driving herself to the reception had felt like reclaiming a small piece of independence, James immediately understood the psychological significance. He explained how his recovery had begun with taking responsibility for small daily decisions before he could tackle the larger challenge of helping other veterans heal. The parallel between Catherine's drive and James's journey toward mental health recovery created an unexpectedly profound conversation. James described how his support groups always emphasized the importance of members taking ownership of their healing process, just as Catherine had taken ownership of her transportation to the castle. The concept of agency, the power to make one's own choices, emerged as a central theme that connected the princess's experience with the work of every volunteer being honored that evening. Sarah Chen, the young entrepreneur whose pandemic innovation had connected thousands of elderly residents with volunteers, brought a generational perspective to the conversations about independence and service. Her efforts succeeded precisely because it empowered both elderly users and volunteers to make their own choices about how to connect and help each other. Sarah explained how technology could enhance human independence rather than replace it, a concept that resonated with Catherine's use of modern communication systems to coordinate her unconventional arrival. The youngest honoree shared her observation that Catherine's decision to drive herself reflected the same spirit of innovation that had motivated her community work. Both involved questioning established patterns and finding more authentic ways to achieve important goals. Sarah's app had challenged traditional assumptions about how elderly residents should receive help, just as Catherine's drive had challenged assumptions about how royals should arrive at official events. Throughout the dinner conversation, Catherine found herself sharing more personal insights than usual, perhaps inspired by the authentic atmosphere that her independent arrival had helped create. She spoke about the balance between respecting traditional protocols and finding ways to remain true to her own values and instincts. The guests responded with their own stories of navigating institutional expectations while pursuing innovative approaches to community service. Dr. Robin Michael Reeves, a retired physician who had established mobile health clinics for underserved rural communities, shared his decision to purchase and outfit medical vans, despite criticism from colleagues who thought such direct action was beneath his professional status. His story, of literally driving health services to people who couldn't reach traditional facilities, created another connection with Catherine's evening drive. Both involved taking direct action rather than relying on established systems. The conversation around the dinner table became increasingly animated as guests realized how much they had in common, despite their different backgrounds and areas of service. Catherine served as both participant and facilitator, asking questions that helped each honoree understand how their individual stories contributed to a larger narrative about citizen initiative and personal responsibility in creating positive change. As coffee was served, Lord Chamberlain Thompson presented each volunteer with a personalized letter of recognition from Catherine, along with a small crystal sculpture commissioned from a British artist. But the most meaningful recognition seemed to come from the quality of conversation and genuine interest that Catherine had shown in each person's work. Several guests later commented that they felt truly heard and understood, rather than simply acknowledged. The informal atmosphere continued as guests were invited to tour selected areas of the castle that weren't normally included in public visits. Catherine personally led the group through Queen Mary's doll's house, sharing stories about the intricate miniature world and its place in royal history. Her enthusiasm for the exhibit was genuine and infectious, creating moments of wonder that reminded everyone present of the importance of preserving joy and curiosity in the midst of serious service work. In the castle's library, Margaret Thompson was particularly moved by the collection of historical texts in multiple languages, seeing connections to her own work in promoting literacy across cultural boundaries. James Parker was drawn to military histories that documented the experiences of veterans from previous conflicts, recognizing the continuity of challenges faced by those who had served their country. Sarah Chen marveled at the preserved technological innovations from past centuries, understanding how each generation had found new ways to solve old problems. The evening's most memorable moment came when the group gathered in St. George's Hall, the magnificent space where royal weddings and state dinners were held. Under the soaring Gothic arches, Catherine spoke informally about the responsibility she felt to honor the example set by the people she had met that evening. Her words were spontaneous and heartfelt, clearly influenced by both the meaningful conversations of the dinner and the sense of authenticity that had characterized the entire event. Catherine's brief remarks focused on the theme of taking ownership, whether of community problems, personal challenges, or in her case, the simple decision of how to arrive at an important event. She thanked the volunteers not just for their specific contributions, but for demonstrating that individual initiative could create meaningful change. The applause that followed was warm and sustained, reflecting the genuine connection that had developed throughout the evening. As the formal portion of the reception concluded, guests began to gather their belongings and prepare for their departures. Several mentioned that they would long remember not just the honor of being recognized at Windsor Castle, but the authentic conversations and genuine connections that had made the evening special. The atmosphere throughout had been more personal and meaningful than typical royal receptions, something many attributed to the tone set by Catherine's unconventional arrival. Margaret Thompson approached Catherine before leaving, expressing her gratitude for the princess's genuine interest in her literacy work and promising to send updates on future program developments. Their conversation had evolved far beyond polite recognition into a real exchange of ideas about empowerment and education. The elderly volunteer's parting comment that she looked forward to many more years of driving herself to community programs drew laughter and warm applause from the other guests. James Parker's departure was equally meaningful, as he and Catherine discussed potential ways that his veteran support programs might collaborate with royal patronage initiatives. The conversation had revealed shared priorities around mental health advocacy and community-based healing approaches. His invitation for Catherine to visit one of his support group meetings was genuinely offered and seriously considered, representing the kind of ongoing engagement that made royal recognition truly valuable. Sarah Chen left with a promise to keep Catherine updated on the evolution of her Community Connection app and its expansion to new populations and geographic areas. Their discussion about technology's role in facilitating human connection had inspired ideas for both of them about innovative approaches to community engagement. The young entrepreneur's energy and vision had clearly inspired Catherine to think more creatively about her own future initiatives. As the last guest departed, Catherine reflected on how the evening had exceeded her expectations in every way. The decision to drive herself had been about reclaiming a small measure of independence, but it had ultimately enhanced her ability to connect authentically with remarkable people doing extraordinary work in their communities. The parallel between her personal journey to the castle and their professional journeys in service had created a foundation for conversations that went far beyond typical royal protocol. By the time Catherine made her way back to her Range Rover for the return journey home, the world had already begun to react to the images of her arrival at Windsor Castle. Social media platforms were buzzing with photos and commentary about the princess driving herself to a royal engagement, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. People from around the globe were sharing their admiration for what they saw as a refreshingly authentic moment in an often formal royal world. The original photographs taken by royal correspondents positioned near the castle entrance showed Catherine with a confident smile as she gripped the steering wheel, her expression radiating the satisfaction of someone who had taken control of their own journey. The images captured something that formal arrival photos rarely conveyed: genuine contentment and personal agency. Within hours, these pictures would be shared millions of times across social media platforms, sparking conversations about modern royalty independence, and authentic leadership. As Catherine settled into the driver's seat for the journey home, she felt the same sense of anticipation that had marked her arrival drive. The evening had been more successful than she had dared to hope, with conversations that had energized her understanding of community service and individual initiative. The drive home would provide time to reflect on the meaningful connections she had made and the insights she had gained from people who had dedicated their lives to helping others. The security arrangements for the return journey were identical to those for her arrival, with Detective Inspector Matthews and her team following at a discreet distance. But the mood was different now, colored by the success of both the unconventional transportation and the meaningful reception that had followed. Catherine used the car's communication system to thank her security team for their flexibility and professionalism in making the evening possible. As she drove through Windsor Great Park once again, this time under a canopy of stars, Catherine reflected on the conversations that had dominated the evening. Each of the honored volunteers had shared stories that demonstrated how individual agency could create meaningful change in the world. Margaret Thompson's literacy programs, James Parker's veteran support networks, Sarah Chen's community connection app, and Dr. Reeves's mobile health clinics all represented examples of people who had seen problems and decided to take direct action to solve them. The parallel between their professional initiatives and her personal decision to drive herself to the reception wasn't lost on Catherine. In a small but meaningful way, she had embodied the same spirit of taking responsibility for outcomes rather than accepting predetermined arrangements. The symbolism had enhanced her ability to connect authentically with people whose life's work involved similar choices about personal agency and community responsibility. Her phone, connected to the car's hands-free system, began receiving calls from senior royal household staff who had been monitoring the public reaction to the evening's events. Private Secretary Amanda Hughes called to report that the response to Catherine's self-driven arrival had been remarkably positive across all demographic groups and political perspectives. The images and story were being shared enthusiastically by people who rarely commented on royal activities, suggesting that the gesture had resonated beyond traditional royal watches. Communications Director Sarah Bradford followed with updates on international media coverage, which was emphasizing the refreshing authenticity of Catherine's approach to royal duties. News outlets across Europe, North America, and the Commonwealth were featuring the story prominently, with commentary focusing on how the simple act of driving herself had humanized the princess and made her seem more relatable to ordinary citizens. The most surprising call came from Kensington Palace's digital media team, reporting that the hashtag #PrincessDrives had begun trending globally on social media platforms. Users were sharing the photos of Catherine at the wheel alongside their own stories about the importance of independence and self-determination. Many were drawing connections between her decision to drive herself and their own experiences of taking control of challenging situations in their personal and professional lives. As Catherine continued through the countryside toward home, she began to understand that her simple decision had tapped into something deeper than royal protocol or media coverage. The public response suggested that people were hungry for authentic moments from their leaders, instances where personal values aligned with public actions. Her drive to Windsor Castle had become a symbol of leadership that prioritized substance over ceremony. The evening's honored guests were also contributing to the expanding conversation. Margaret Thompson had given an impromptu interview to a local television station, explaining how Catherine's decision to drive herself had demonstrated the same kind of personal initiative that she tried to encourage in her literacy students. The elderly volunteer's enthusiasm for what she called royal self-reliance was being quoted in news stories around the world. James Parker had posted on his organization's social media accounts, describing how Catherine's independent arrival had set the tone for meaningful conversations about taking ownership of one's circumstances. His post about the connection between personal agency and community service was being shared widely among veterans groups and mental health advocates, expanding the conversation beyond royal watchers to people actively engaged in similar service work. Sarah Chen had written a blog post about the evening that focused on Catherine's use of technology to coordinate her unconventional arrival while maintaining security protocols. Her analysis of how innovation could honor tradition while creating new possibilities was resonating with entrepreneurs and community organizers who faced similar challenges in their own work. As Catherine approached the familiar roads near her home, she received a call from Prince William, who had been monitoring the evening's developments from his own engagement in London. His delight at the positive response to her independent drive was evident, but he was even more pleased by her obvious satisfaction with the entire experience. Their conversation focused not on the media attention, but on the meaningful connection she had made with the evening's guests. William's observation that the evening had seemed to recharge Catherine's enthusiasm for royal duties was perceptive and important. The combination of personal independence and meaningful service work had created exactly the kind of experience that sustained long-term commitment to public service. Her decision to drive herself had been about more than transportation. It had been about maintaining the authentic connection to her own values that made effective royal service possible. The following morning brought even more evidence of the story's impact. Newspaper editorials across Britain praised Catherine's gesture as representing the kind of monarchy that would remain relevant in the 21st century. Commentary focused on how small acts of independence and authenticity could strengthen rather than weaken institutional traditions. International coverage was equally positive, with royal correspondents noting that Catherine's drive represented a perfect balance between respecting protocols and maintaining personal agency. Several articles compared her approach to that of other European royals who had successfully modernized their roles while preserving essential traditions. Perhaps most significantly, the story had inspired ordinary citizens to share their own experiences of taking control of challenging situations. Social media platforms were filled with stories of people who had chosen to drive themselves to important events, job interviews, medical appointments, and family celebrations rather than relying on others for transportation. Catherine's decision had reminded people of the empowerment that comes from taking responsibility for one's own journey. The impact extended beyond individual stories to policy discussions about independence and community service. Several members of Parliament referenced Catherine's evening drive in speeches about the importance of citizen initiative and personal responsibility in addressing social challenges. The story had provided a compelling example of leadership that encouraged rather than discouraged individual agency. 3 months after the Windsor Castle reception, Catherine received follow-up reports from each of the honoured volunteers describing how the recognition had enhanced their ability to expand their community programs. Margaret Thompson's literacy initiative had received additional funding and volunteer support following the media coverage of her royal recognition. James Parker's Veteran Support Network had established new chapters in 3 additional cities, with many veterans citing the princess's authentic approach as inspiration for seeking help. Sarah Chen's Community Connection app had expanded to serve additional populations and geographic areas, with many new users mentioning their admiration for Catherine's combination of tradition and innovation. Dr. Reeves's mobile health clinics had received donations that allowed the purchase of additional vehicles, extending medical services to even more underserved rural communities. The long-term impact of Catherine's decision to drive herself to Windsor Castle extended far beyond that single evening. It had demonstrated how authentic leadership could inspire others to take ownership of their own circumstances while serving their communities. The simple act of controlling her own transportation had become a symbol of the kind of monarchy that could remain relevant and inspiring in an increasingly complex world. Years later, royal historians would identify Catherine's drive to Windsor Castle as a defining moment in the evolution of modern monarchy. The combination of personal authenticity and meaningful service had created a template for royal engagement that honored tradition while embracing the values of independence and individual agency that resonated with contemporary society. Her hands on the steering wheel that autumn evening had guided more than just a vehicle. They had helped steer the monarchy toward a more authentic and sustainable future.